In 1870, Dallas, Texas had a population of 3,000 people. No railroad, no port, no navigable river, no coal, no iron, no timber worth the name, and no geographic reason whatsoever for anyone to build anything there. 30 years later, it was the most populous city in the state. 50 years later, it housed a Federal Reserve Bank, the tallest building west of the Mississippi, and a luxury hotel that critics called the most beautiful building west of Venice. A century later, it anchored one of the largest metropolitan economies on earth. No American city has ever done more with less. And the way Dallas pulled it off is one of the great business stories nobody tells, because it isn't about oil or cattle or cotton or any single industry. It's about selling. Dallas is the city that had nothing and sold the world on everything. The man who started it was a Tennessee lawyer named John Neely Bryan, and his founding of Dallas in 1841 was, depending on your generosity, either an act of frontier vision or a confidence game. Bryan had first visited the spot 2 years earlier, in 1839, scouting for a place to set up a trading post with the Caddo and Creek Indians whose villages dotted the Trinity River. He liked what he saw: a natural ford, the only reliable river crossing for miles at the intersection of two well-worn Indian trails. He went back to Arkansas to settle his affairs. By the time he returned in November 1841, the Texas Rangers had burned the Indian village to the ground and driven the tribes away. Half his intended customer base was gone. A reasonable man would have moved on. Bryan was not a reasonable man. He built a 10 by 12-foot log cabin on the east bank of the Trinity and began telling every settler he could find that this was the place, the future crossroads of Texas. He ran the post office. He ran a general store. He ran a ferry across the river. He persuaded a surveyor named J.P. Dumas to come out and lay a proper town site in 1844, a half-mile square grid of streets and lots. He donated his own land for a county courthouse. When Dallas County needed a county seat in 1850, Bryan personally canvassed voters across the county to make sure they chose his settlement over the neighboring towns of Cedar Springs and Oak Cliff. Dallas won by a narrow margin. Cedar Springs and Oak Cliff would both eventually be absorbed into Dallas, but that was the kind of outcome Bryan specialized in. Everything eventually getting pulled into his orbit. He had pinned his hopes on the Trinity River becoming a navigable commercial waterway connecting Dallas to the Gulf of Mexico. It never did. The Trinity was silty, shallow, and unpredictable, prone to catastrophic flooding in the spring and barely a trickle in the fall. Every attempt to run a commercial vessel down it failed. The river that was supposed to be Dallas's reason for existing turned out to be a muddy ditch that periodically destroyed people's homes. And this is the essential thing to understand about Dallas from the very beginning. The stated justification never quite held up. The actual engine was always something else. Someone's refusal to accept the geography they'd been dealt. Bryan himself came to an unhappy end. He shot a man who'd insulted his wife in 1855 and fled to the Creek Nation for 6 years. He joined the Confederacy at 50. By 1874, his mind had deteriorated beyond recovery. His own son testified in court that his father was insane, and Bryan was committed to the state asylum in Austin, where he died in 1877. The founder of Dallas spent his last years in a lunatic asylum. The city he left behind had a population of perhaps 5,000, and it was about to perform an act of commercial larceny so brazen that it changed the trajectory of the American Southwest. By the early 1870s, 2 major railroads were inching across Texas. The Houston and Texas Central was building northward from Houston. The Texas and Pacific was building westward from Marshall, aimed eventually at San Diego. Neither line was planned to pass through Dallas. The Houston and Texas Central was headed for Corsicana, 20 miles to the southeast. The Texas and Pacific had its own route calculations, and Dallas wasn't on them. In the railroad age, a town the tracks missed was a town that died. Dallas leaders understood this with perfect clarity. What happened next would define the city's character for the next century and a half. A group of Dallas businessmen, led by a man named William H. Gaston, offered the Houston and Texas Central $5,000 in cash, plus donated right-of-way through their land, to shift the railroad's route 20 miles to the west and run it straight through Dallas. $5,000 in 1871 was not a trivial sum for a small prairie town. The railroad took the money. On July 16, 1872, the first Houston and Texas Central train pulled into Dallas, and the town threw a barbecue for its 5,000 cheering residents. John Neely Bryan, old and failing but still alive, stood on the platform for the welcoming ceremony. He had waited 31 years for that train. But Dallas wasn't finished. One railroad made you a stop. Two railroads made you a junction, and a junction was a city. The problem was that Dallas couldn't afford to pay the Texas and Pacific the way it had paid the Houston and Texas Central. So Dallas leaders found another way. They had a rider attached to a bill in the Texas state legislature, a quiet, almost invisible amendment requiring the Texas and Pacific to route its tracks through a place called Browder Springs. Browder Springs happened to be just south of Main Street in Dallas. It was a legislative trick, elegant and ruthless, and it worked. In 1873, the Texas and Pacific arrived. Dallas was now the first major rail intersection in the state of Texas, and it had manufactured that intersection entirely through cash, land donations, and political maneuvering. The geography hadn't changed. The city had simply refused to accept it. The results were immediate and dramatic. In 1870, Dallas had 3,000 residents. By 1872, with the first railroad, it had more than doubled. By 1880, the census counted 10,358. By 1890, after a decade as a rail crossroads, the number was 38,067, making Dallas the most populous city in Texas, surpassing both Houston and San Antonio. The city had tripled in 10 years. Merchants who had followed the railroad construction crews northward from Houston settled in Dallas on speculation that the crossroads would become something significant. They opened dry goods stores and clothiers and wholesale operations, and they were right. Cotton from the surrounding blackland prairie poured into Dallas by wagon and rail, headed for markets in the East and in Europe. Dallas didn't grow the cotton. The blackland farms outside of town did that. But Dallas ginned it, brokered it, financed it, and shipped it. By the turn of the 20th century, Dallas was the world's leading inland cotton market, and the Dallas Cotton Exchange, organized in 1907, formalized a trade that was already generating enormous wealth. The city also led the world in the manufacture of cotton gin machinery and saddlery, making the tools the cotton economy needed, not just moving the product. It was the leading wholesale market in the entire Southwest for books, drugs, jewelry, and liquor. Main Street was lit with electricity by 1885. The streetcars ran all day. The population had hit 42,000 by 1900, and the city directory listed 115 dressmakers. Dallas was a raw place, but it was a raw place that was making money, and money had a way of attracting more of itself. It wasn't all upward, of course. In 1893, a national financial panic hit Dallas hard. 5 banks failed. Several industries collapsed. Cotton prices dropped to less than 5 cents a pound. Only 62 new manufacturing firms were established in the entire decade of the 1890s. But the city did what it would always do. It sold its way out of trouble. By 1900, the economy had recovered, and Dallas had diversified just enough to survive the cotton downturns, a lesson its business leaders would remember. The woman who arguably did more than anyone to build the physical infrastructure of early Dallas was Sarah Horton Cockrell, and her story is almost too perfect a metaphor for the city itself. Born in Virginia in 1819, she married Alexander Cockrell in 1847. Alexander purchased the last of John Neely Bryan's original townsite holdings for $7,000, and the couple ran a ferry, a sawmill, and a grist mill on the Trinity. Alexander couldn't read or write. Sarah handled all the correspondence, the accounts, the money. In 1858, Alexander was shot dead by the city marshal over a debt. Sarah was 38 with 4 children under 10. She did not retreat. She opened the St. Nicholas Hotel, Dallas's first 3-story building, only to see it destroyed in a citywide fire in 1860. She built another hotel. She went before the Texas legislature and obtained a charter to build the first iron bridge over the Trinity River, completing it in 1872, just in time for the railroad's arrival. That bridge connected Dallas to every major road running south and west. She bought into a flour mill when flour milling was the city's major industry. She developed a residential subdivision. She built an office building. By the time she died in 1892, Sarah Horton Cockrell owned approximately 1/4 of downtown Dallas and was one of the first millionaires in Texas. Every office in the city closed for her funeral. A historical marker later put it plainly: a man founded Dallas, a woman's courage pushed it forward. By the early 1900s, Dallas had roughly 43,000 people and an energy about it, a self-conscious ambition that visitors found either intoxicating or slightly absurd. Some streets were still unpaved. Railroad tracks crisscrossed the busiest downtown intersections. The concentration of saloons and drinking dives around Elm and Murphy Streets was so dense that respectable women avoided the neighborhood. There were fewer doctors than barkeepers. And yet into this raw prairie town, in September of 1907, 3 young people in their 20s walked and opened a store that sold Lanvin gowns and Bradley of London suits to the wives of ranchers and cotton brokers. It was, by any conventional analysis, a preposterous idea. The existing Dallas department stores, Sanger Brothers, A. Harris and Company, sold sensible goods to sensible people. Nobody had attempted high fashion. Their names were Herbert Marcus, his sister Carrie Marcus Neiman, and her husband Abraham Lincoln Neiman. They had just come from Atlanta, where they'd run a successful sales promotion firm. When they cashed out, they had $25,000 and a choice: invest in the franchise rights for a new soft drink called Coca-Cola, or go back to Dallas and open a clothing store. They chose the store. For the rest of its existence, the family liked to say that Neiman Marcus was founded on bad business judgment. Within weeks of opening, their entire initial inventory, acquired on a buying trip to New York by Carrie, was sold out. Oil-rich Texans, it turned out, were desperate for a place to spend money with taste. Neiman Marcus gave them one, and it became one of the most famous luxury retailers in American history. All from a storefront on Elm Street in a town where cowboys and Indians had attended the grand opening. What Neiman Marcus did for fashion, a St. Louis beer magnate was about to do for architecture. In 1910, Adolphus Busch, co-founder of the Anheuser-Busch Brewing Company, one of the richest men in America, purchased the land beneath Dallas's City Hall at Commerce and Achard Streets for $250,000 and announced he would build a 20-story, European-style luxury hotel. The city of Dallas owned that land. They had a police department, a firehouse, and city offices sitting on it. They cleared out so fast you'd think the building was on fire. A temporary city hall was hastily arranged on Commerce Street. The old one was demolished by October. Busch hired the St. Louis architectural firm Barnett, Haynes and Barnett and commissioned a Beaux-Arts palace modeled on a Germanic castle, only taller. It cost $1.8 million, somewhere around $34 million in today's money. There was one hitch. In July 1911, with the building already 7 stories high, prohibition looked likely in Dallas, and Busch's representatives halted construction. A beer magnate building a hotel in a dry city was, they said, untenable. Within days, Dallas businessmen and civic leaders talked them back into it. Work resumed on August 1st. The Adolphus Hotel opened on October 5th, 1912. 22 stories of Baroque splendor, the tallest building in the state of Texas. Adolphus Busch died 13 months later in Germany. Prohibition came to Dallas 13 months after that. The hotel survived and thrived anyway, its Century Room becoming a national sensation in the age of big band, hosting the Andrews Sisters, Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, and Bob Hope. KRLD Radio began broadcasting live from inside the building in 1936. A retractable ice rink operated in the ballroom for 35 years. The Adolphus kicked off a building boom that would transform the Dallas skyline throughout the 1910s and 1920s. The Praetorian Building, the Bush Building, the Kirby Building. One after another, towers of limestone and brick went up along Commerce and Main and Elm Streets, each one taller and more ornate than the last, each one a statement of intent from a city that was barely 70 years old and already building like it had something to prove. Which, of course, it did. A decade after the Adolphus went up, another building rose next door at the corner of Achard and Commerce that would give Dallas its lasting symbol. The Magnolia Petroleum Company, a Texas oil outfit, commissioned the British architect Alfred Bossum to design its new headquarters. The result was a 29-story Beaux-Arts tower completed in 1922 at a cost of $4 million. It was the tallest building in Dallas, the tallest west of the Mississippi, taller than anything in Europe at the time, and among the first high-rises in the country to have air conditioning. A local reporter described it as a great peg driven into the ground, holding Dallas in its place. 12 years later, in 1934, the Magnolia Company decided to put its corporate logo on the roof, a red Pegasus, the winged horse of Greek mythology, a symbol of wealth and power and defiance of gravity. The Dallas Sign Company Texlight built the thing in 6 weeks. 2 mirrored images of a neon-lit red horse mounted on a derrick-like base that rotated so the creature could be seen from every direction. 40 feet long and 30 feet high, glowing red against the night sky. People said you could see it from 75 miles away. It went up in time for the American Petroleum Institute's annual meeting that November. It was supposed to be temporary. It never came down. The red Pegasus became the symbol of Dallas, a mythical animal that has no business flying, mounted on a building in a city that has no business existing, both of them defying every natural law that says they shouldn't be there. It still flies above the Magnolia Building today. The year the Pegasus went up was also the year Dallas pulled off what might have been its most audacious civic sales job yet. And that's saying something. In 1914, the Federal Reserve Act had created 12 reserve bank districts across the country, and Dallas, despite being the smallest city selected, won one of them. The decision stunned almost everyone. Houston, Fort Worth, San Antonio, and New Orleans had all competed. New Orleans had a population 3 times Dallas's size. But Dallas's business leaders had done 2 things their rivals hadn't. First, they produced a leather-bound, gold-embossed book called Texas and the Southwest, a book of facts, stuffed with statistics on factory output, building permits, and banking growth, demonstrating that while New Orleans's banking market had flatlined, Dallas's had more than doubled in a decade. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the Dallas Morning News publisher George B. Dealey and Dallas banking leaders cultivated relationships with key figures in the Wilson administration, including Postmaster General Albert Burleson, a Texan with influence over the decision. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas opened on November 16, 1914. It gave Dallas something no amount of railroad bribery or hotel construction could: institutional financial power. The kind of power that compounded over decades, that attracted more banks, more insurance companies, more corporate headquarters. The kind of power that turned a cotton market into a financial capital. Then came 1936, and Dallas did it again. The state of Texas was celebrating the centennial of its independence from Mexico, and 3 cities, Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, competed to host the Central Exposition. San Antonio had the Alamo. Houston had the San Jacinto battlefield, where the decisive Battle of Independence had actually been fought. Dallas had no historical connection to Texas independence whatsoever. Dallas won anyway by pledging a cash commitment of $7.8 million, a staggering sum during the Great Depression, plus the existing facilities of the State Fair at Fair Park. Houston and San Antonio couldn't match the money. The Centennial Commission chose Dallas, and the architect George Dahl led a team of 130 designers in transforming Fair Park's 185 acres into a $25 million World's Fair in 9.5 months. More than 50 new buildings went up, most of them in a streamlined Art Deco style that remains today one of the finest surviving collections of exposition architecture in the country. Over 6 million people visited, including President Franklin Roosevelt. The exposition created over 10,000 jobs and pumped an estimated $50 million into the Dallas economy. It was, remarkably, the first air-conditioned World's Fair in history. Visitors could walk 7 miles through indoor pathways in cooled comfort during a Texas summer. Fort Worth, not to be outdone, staged its own competing exposition across town. The promoter, Billy Rose, explained the difference with a slogan: "Go to Dallas for education. Come to Fort Worth for entertainment." The rivalry between the 2 cities, separated by 30 miles of prairie, was and remains one of the great urban feuds in America. But the point was made. Dallas, the city with no historical connection to Texas independence, had hosted the state's centennial celebration by outspending every city that did. Here is the thing about Dallas and oil, and it's the detail that most people get wrong. Dallas is not an oil city. There is no significant oil production in Dallas or Dallas County. The great Texas oil strikes, Spindletop in 1901 near Beaumont, the Permian Basin in the 1920s, the enormous East Texas field discovered by a 70-year-old wildcat promoter named Dad Joyner in 1930, all happened hundreds of miles away. What Dallas became was the place where the oil money lived. The wildcatters drilled in Midland and Odessa and East Texas, but they banked in Dallas. They lawyered in Dallas. They headquartered their companies in Dallas. Men like H.L. Hunt, who in 1930 parlayed a poker game and a handshake deal with Dad Joyner into oil leases that would make him one of the richest men in the world, chose Dallas as his home. He lived in a replica of Mount Vernon in the Highland Park neighborhood and ran his empire from an office downtown. Clint Murchison, who built a financial empire spanning oil, construction, insurance, and eventually the Dallas Cowboys, operated from Dallas. Sid Richardson, another oil billionaire, kept his business interests rooted in the Dallas-Fort Worth axis. The Magnolia Petroleum Company, later absorbed into Mobil, was headquartered in that tower with the Pegasus on top. Dallas didn't need to have oil in the ground. It had the banks, the lawyers, the accountants, and the deal makers. And in the oil business, those were the people who ended up with the largest and most durable share of the money. Oil wells run dry. Banks don't. It was the same trick Dallas had been running since 1872. You don't need to have the resource. You just need to be the place where the resource gets traded. This pattern, this insistence on being the headquarters, the exchange, the hub, rather than the source, extended into the next transformative industry to hit the city. World War II had already begun reshaping Dallas's economy. The federal government built military installations across North Texas, and defense contractors arrived. North American Aviation set up a massive plant in the area, producing aircraft for the war effort. The population surged past 294,000 by 1940 and would hit 434,000 by 1950. Dallas was diversifying beyond cotton and oil into something new: technology and defense. The seed of that transformation had been planted quietly in 1934, when a small geophysical surveying company called Geophysical Service Incorporated relocated from Newark, New Jersey to Dallas following the oil business. GSI mapped subsurface geology for oil companies, and one of the men who came with it was a Brooklyn-born son of Swedish immigrants named J. Eric Johnson. As Johnson later recalled, he drove his family along Dallas's residential streets that first day and told them, bubbling with excitement over the city's energy, that this would be their home forever. GSI had a sideline in electronics, building instruments for oil exploration, and during World War II, the company produced electronic equipment for the Army Signal Corps and the Navy. After the war, Johnson and his partners, Eugene McDermott and Cecil Green, recognized that the future was in electronics, not seismic surveys. In 1951, they renamed the company. They called it Texas Instruments. In 1954, TI produced the Regency TR-1, the world's first commercial transistor radio, a pocket-sized device that brought the new transistor technology to ordinary consumers. In the summer of 1958, a new engineer named Jack Kilby arrived at Texas Instruments' Dallas offices. Kilby had just been hired and hadn't earned any vacation time, so when the rest of the staff left for the company's mandatory July shutdown, he found himself alone in an empty laboratory with nothing but time and a problem to solve. The problem was called the tyranny of numbers, the fact that electronic circuits required thousands of individual components, each one hand-soldered to the next, an expensive, unreliable nightmare. Kilby's insight, conceived during those solitary weeks, was that all the components could be made from the same piece of semiconductor material. No external wires, no hand soldering. On September 12, 1958, he demonstrated a working prototype to his managers, a rough-looking piece of germanium with gold wiring containing a transistor, a capacitor, and 3 resistors on a single chip. It looked, by one account, like a child's failed art project. It was the integrated circuit, the microchip, arguably the most consequential invention of the second half of the 20th century. Kilby won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2000. He'd conceived of it in an empty lab in Dallas, Texas, because he was the new guy and couldn't get vacation time. And then came November 22nd, 1963. The morning was clear and warm for late November. President John F. Kennedy's motorcade turned off Houston Street and onto Elm, passing through Dealey Plaza, the small downtown park named for George B. Dealey, the very same Dallas Morning News publisher who had helped win the Federal Reserve Bank half a century earlier. Dealey Plaza sat only yards from the spot where John Neely Bryan had built his log cabin in 1841. At 12:30 p.m., shots were fired from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, a nondescript brick warehouse at the corner of the plaza. The president was pronounced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital at 1 o'clock. 2 days later, nightclub owner Jack Ruby shot the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, on live television in the basement of the Dallas police station. The entire world watched. The reaction was swift and merciless. Dallas became the city of hate. Editorials from New York to London assigned collective guilt to the entire population. Hate mail poured into city offices. Dallas school children reported being taunted. The city that had spent a century selling itself to the world suddenly found the world refusing to buy. For a place whose entire identity was built on promotion and image, this was not just a tragedy. It was an existential crisis. A wound that went to the soul, one civic leader called it. The man who stepped into the breach was Eric Johnson, the same Eric Johnson who had co-founded Texas Instruments, who had stood on the tarmac at Love Field that morning to welcome the presidential party, who that afternoon had made the official announcement to the crowd at the Dallas Trade Mart that the president had been shot. In February 1964, Johnson became mayor, and he responded to the crisis with the only tool Dallas had ever really known: a plan, a pitch, and the will to execute both. He called it Goals for Dallas, a comprehensive civic program that enlisted more than 100 organizations across 12 task forces covering everything from education to transportation to public safety. It was, in essence, a business plan for a city's self-reinvention. "We must dream no small dreams," Johnson said. "We must envision great, ambitious goals." By the time he left office in 1971, Dallas had gone from the city of hate to being named the All-American City. Within 7 years, Johnson pushed through a $175 million bond that financed a new city hall, not an addition to the old one, but an entirely new building designed by E.M. Pei, the architect who would go on to design the Louvre Pyramid. He built a new central library. He helped found the University of Texas at Dallas. And he tackled the problem that had bedeviled the region for decades: the airport rivalry between Dallas and Fort Worth. Dallas had Love Field. Fort Worth had its own airports. Neither was big enough, and the two cities couldn't agree on sharing. Johnson forced the issue. When engineers proposed an 8,000-acre regional airport, Johnson said it needed to be bigger. On January 13, 1974, Dallas-Fort Worth Regional Airport opened for commercial service. The first flight to touch down was American Airlines Flight 341 from New York, routed through Memphis and Little Rock. It covered 17,500 acres, 27 square miles, an area larger than the island of Manhattan. It was the largest airport in the world. It cost $875 million, including $65 million for the land and $810 million in construction. Its dedication ceremony, a few months earlier, had featured the first landing of a supersonic Concorde on American soil, an Air France jet en route from Caracas to Paris, touching down on the flat Texas prairie where ranchers had grazed cattle 5 years before. A photograph taken that day shows the Concorde on the tarmac, with a boy on horseback in the foreground. It was pure Dallas, the most futuristic machine in the world, landing on land that had been nothing, in a city that had been nothing, next to a kid on a horse. The airport would become the second busiest in the world, the primary hub of American Airlines, a gateway to 269 destinations, and the economic engine that powered the next half-century of regional growth. Love Field, the old airport near downtown, saw its traffic collapse from 7 million passengers in 1973 to less than 500,000 by 1975. By then, the city had found another entirely unexpected vehicle for rehabilitating its image. The Dallas Cowboys, founded in 1960 and for years a hapless expansion franchise, became, under coach Tom Landry, one of the most successful and recognizable teams in professional sports. They won their first Super Bowl in January 1972. By the mid-1970s, they were being marketed as America's Team, their star logo as widely recognized as any corporate trademark in the country. The glamour, the cheerleaders, the mystique of Landry in his fedora on the sideline. It gave the nation a version of Dallas that had nothing to do with Dealey Plaza. And then, in 1978, CBS debuted a primetime television drama about a wealthy Texas oil family called, simply, Dallas. When 83 million Americans tuned in on November 21, 1980, to find out who shot J.R. Ewing, it was the most watched television broadcast in American history to that point. The show ran for 13 seasons and was broadcast in 90 countries. It was fiction, obviously, a soap opera, but it accomplished something that a century of real estate deals and railroad bribes and leather-bound books of facts had not. It made Dallas famous in a way that had nothing to do with an assassination. For millions of people around the world, Dallas was now the place where the rich lived large and the deals never stopped. Which, in a sense, was the truest thing anyone had ever said about it. The corporate migrations tell the story in numbers. In the decades after DFW Airport opened, company after company relocated its headquarters to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, drawn by the airport's connectivity, the absence of a state income tax, the relatively low cost of living, and, this cannot be underestimated, a civic culture that had been relentlessly, almost pathologically pro-business since John Neely Bryan first ran his ferry across the Trinity. AT&T moved from San Antonio. ExxonMobil settled in Irving, just outside Dallas. J.C. Penney came from New York. Kimberly-Clark came from Wisconsin. Toyota moved its North American headquarters from Torrance, California. The city also built itself a cultural infrastructure that would have astonished the cowboys and dressmakers of 1907. The Dallas Arts District, one of the largest urban arts districts in the country, assembled a collection of buildings by architects whose names read like a roll call of late 20th century greatness. The Meyerson Symphony Center, designed by I.M. Pei and opened in 1989. Its interior acoustics engineered to concert hall perfection. The Nasher Sculpture Center, designed by Renzo Piano and opened in 2003. An airy travertine pavilion housing one of the finest private sculpture collections in the world. The AT&T Performing Arts Center, with buildings by Norman Foster and Rem Koolhaas, completed in 2009. These weren't vanity projects. They were, in a very Dallas way, investments, part of a calculated strategy to make the city attractive to the kind of people and companies that choose where to live based on quality of life, not just tax rates. By the 2020s, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex had a gross metropolitan product exceeding $600 billion a year, ranking it among the top 10 metropolitan economies in the world, ahead of entire countries. The population of the metro area exceeded 7.5 million. And all of it, every skyscraper, every corporate campus, every terminal at DFW, every dollar moving through the Federal Reserve Bank on Pearl Street, every symphony played inside I.M. Pei's concert hall, every flight departing for Tokyo or London or Sao Paulo, all of it sits on the same flat, featureless, resource-poor patch of North Texas prairie where John Neely Bryan put up a tent in 1841 because the Indians he'd planned to trade with had already been driven away. No harbor, no river worth the name, no coal, no iron, no oil. Just flat land, big ambitions, and a seemingly genetic inability to take no for an answer. Every great American city has a founding advantage. Boston has its harbor, Pittsburgh has its rivers, Denver has its mountain pass, Houston has its ship channel. Dallas has nothing except the accumulated consequence of 180 years of people looking at nothing and deciding, with a confidence that borders on delusion, that it would be enough. The original Pegasus, the neon red horse that Texlite built for $7,000 in 1934, stayed on top of the Magnolia Building for 65 years. By the 1990s, it was rusted, bullet-pocked for reasons no one could quite explain, its motor dead since 1974, its neon long dark. It was taken down in 1999. Dallas raised $600,000 from private donors to build a replacement, and on New Year's Eve 1999, as the millennium turned, thousands packed the downtown streets to watch a new red Pegasus light up above the skyline at the stroke of midnight. Mayor Ron Kirk told the crowd that nothing had symbolized the city better than the flying red horse. The original, the rusted one, disappeared for 15 years. A team of searchers finally found it in a city storage shed at White Rock Lake. It was restored, and in 2015 it was installed on the ground in front of the Omni Dallas Hotel, no longer looking down on the city from above, but looking up at the sky, closer now to the people who remembered it. A flying horse that can't fly anymore, grounded and restored and still glowing red in a city that was never supposed to fly either.